This is Suzanne Wagner of the C.G. Jung Institute of Los Angeles. In the next hour, you will view a conversation I held with William McGuire in March of 1982. Mr. McGuire has served as executive editor for the publication in English of the collected works of C.G. Jung. He has also served as editor of the Freud Jung Letters. In this hour, he recalls the colorful history of the way the Bollingen Foundation came into being. He also tells us of his personal contacts with Jung in later years as the publication of the collected works was nearing completion. In 1982, a book by McGuire himself came out, Bollingen, An Adventure in Collecting the Past. This book is a treasure trove of information and anecdote presented in a warm and readable style. It covers the rich and varied publications and activities of the Foundation, which include the work of several other European and American cultural figures, as well as Jung. Over the course of the years, McGuire has published a number of articles which reveal his unique observations on Jung's personality and Jung's involvement with the publication of his work. It was a great pleasure to meet with Bill McGuire and to have an opportunity to bring his historical perspective, his insight, and his dry and humane sense of humor to the viewer. Well, Bill McGuire, I'd like to ask you about your relationship to the Bollingen Foundation, and it's been a long history there, and your relationship to Jung, and some of your impressions of the early days of how things got started with Bollingen and in the publication of his collected works in English. Can you give me a little history of that?
Yes. I myself got involved in 1948 when the Bollingen Foundation was fairly new. It had been established in 1945. I was a freelance editor in New York, and I simply got an assignment from Helen Wolf, who was of the Pantheon staff and who handled such things for the Bollingen Foundation, to do some editorial work. And I paid my first visit in that fall, probably September of 1948, down to the Bollingen office in Washington Square in a very dilapidated building, and met those people and began to work on one thing after another. Nothing at that time that could be called Jungian. Mm-hmm. I only had the vaguest idea that there was something to do with Jung in the background of the Bollingen, but they hadn't at that time begun to work on the collected edition.
Was this Mary Mellon's brainchild, so to speak? Was this
yes.
Something?
Well, now, to do justice to that, I really should go back to Mary Mellon's beginning, mm-hmm. With the whole Jung connection. She was a native of Kansas City, had a perfectly ordinary, pleasant upbringing, and was a lively young woman, sort of frivolous, and interested in art, worked in New York City first in an art gallery, John Becker's gallery on Madison Avenue, and she met Paul Mellon at about the same time that she also met Maud Oakes and Nancy Wilson Ross and Marion Willard, who also had a famous art gallery. It's still called the Willard Gallery. So that their common interest was indeed art, mostly avant-garde art. And at the same time, she met John Barrett, who was a young man also interested in art, who did a great deal of traveling, was a sort of amateur of fine art, especially the most avant-garde, which is what Becker showed. And she met Paul Mellon by almost an accident. She was invited to go sleigh riding by Lucius Beebe, who had been a friend of her first husband. She'd been married previously, divorced. And Lucius brought along a pal of his named Paul Mellon to go on the sleigh ride. It was, I think, the day before Christmas in 1934. And they rode in the sleigh to the Central Park Casino. And since they were the first party to arrive there on the day of the first snow of the season, the Central Park Casino gave them a bottle of champagne. And this was the beginning of a lovely courtship. And she and Paul were married the following year. In the meantime, Mary's friends, whom I mentioned, had all gotten involved in Jungian analysis in New York. They were, I think, all patients of the Van Waverens, whom I've mentioned before, Erlo and Anne Van Waveren, whose credentials as Jungian analysts are a little bit complicated and possibly not exactly of the most. There was no institute, for example, to attend or be graduated from. They had met Jung and read Jung. So Mary scoffed at the whole thing. She says, I hope I never get caught up in that sort of thing. But within a couple of months, she had started analyzing with Anne Van Waveren. And when she and Paul married, he too began to work with one or the other of them. And while they lived in Pittsburgh, they kept a pied-à-terre in Manhattan, and they came in for their interviews with the Van Waverens at that point. And became, as everyone does, who becomes a Jungian patient, they read everything. And when Jung came to New York to lecture in 1937, they made a point of attending and met Jung for the first time. And he was very friendly and cordial to them, and they told him they hoped to work with him. He told them to write to his secretary. In the meantime, they had ordered the seminars from Mary Foote, the woman in Zurich who was editing the seminars. That's an interesting letter I ran across in an archive, their request for everything she could send them. So off she sent all the seminar volumes to Pittsburgh, to the Mellons. And they then wrote to Mary John Schmidt, Jung's famous secretary, and she said they wanted to come over and start work with him. She said, he's very busy, I doubt if he can take you. Why don't you write me in 3 months or something of the kind? Well, they finally were given an appointment, and they went with their little girl, who was about 2 years old, first to London, where Mary's portrait was painted, and the child's was too, and then to Zurich, where they indeed met Jung, and Mary sat in on some of the seminars. The seminar that was going on then, that was the Zarathustra. Yes. And her name turns up in the transcript. She speaks up, says something. What she said was mistaken, but she says something in any case. It was nice to think she spoke up. Paul seems not to have attended the seminars, or if he did, he didn't speak up. He is a little unsure whether he went or not. They worked with Jung for a little bit, and they worked with Tony Wolff later on as well. After their month in Zurich that summer, they went down to Ascona. They had met Carrie Baines, and she said, you must come with me to Ascona and meet Olga Ferber-Kaptein, the director of the Eranos. So down they met, and they met Mrs. Ferber, and they clicked instantly. The Van Waverens were there at the same time. And Erlo describes their meeting as being a meeting of two minds that were exactly the same. That is to say, Mary and Olga. Later on, Mary wrote Olga, wrote her many letters, but in one letter she said, Bollingen is my Eranos. But it was then that the idea began to take root that they should devote their millions of dollars to something to do with Jung's work. The first gift they made to the Jungian cause was, I believe, a sum of money to Mary Foote to help her with the work on the seminars, transcribing, publishing. Then they also were vastly impressed by the I Ching, which even that early Carrie Baines had begun to translate, and they sat in on an I Ching session, and Mary was fascinated, and that was another ambition to publish the I Ching translation. Carrie Baines had to say to her, I've already signed a contract with Routledge and Kegan Paul in London. So years and years later, there had to be a common arrangement made with Routledge. They came back to America, having made arrangements to return for a year or more. And so they came back in 1939 and first attended the Aranos Conference. You see, the previous visit, there was no Aranos Conference going on. They just met the personalities. The next year, they attended the conference. They became extremely friendly with Heinrich Zimmer, that was the chief one, and with Massignon.
Where did Zimmer live at the time? Was he based in England, or?
Yes. He had to leave Germany with his wife, who was partly Jewish, and they were at Oxford, living on a very meager income, but they managed to get down to the Aranos.
So your impression that Mary was truly the inspired partner of the Mellons toward this
no doubt
project?
About that. Paul went along with it all enthusiastically, but it was Mary's concern. And they spent that whole winter in Zurich in analysis and busy in the Jungian circle there. Spells of bad health afflicted her. She had asthma, and the cold weather would bring on attacks. And one of the reasons, ostensible reasons for her going to Jung was to do something about her asthma. I think it was partly that, but I think it was more just the wish to explore her own psyche and have the experience of analysis. Well, war began to threaten and broke out, and in 1940, in the spring, they had to come back suddenly. And from then on, throughout the war years, there was a sporadic correspondence between her and Jung. But upon getting home, she began to lay the plans for publishing and decided to call it the Bollingen Press. And as her editor, she brought in Carrie Baines' daughter, Jimena de Angulo, who was just fresh out of Middlebury College, a very bright young woman who knew several languages and had grown up in the Zurich Jungian world. It was probably a good choice. And they actually established a Bollingen Foundation in December of 1941, just after Pearl Harbor, and began to plan various publications, including Aranos papers. The I Ching was on the program, and eventually Jung. Yes.
When did Mary Mellon die?
She died in 1946.
Oh.
I'll very quickly sketch what happened. This first foundation had to be dissolved in June of 1941 because of the complications of working with people in Europe. The Mellons' lawyers insisted that there not be any contact with people in a neutral country. Seems odd. And Mary then was about to give birth to her son and got out of things for some months. But in 1942, 43, she began to revive it, and she established the Bollingen series as a program of her husband's Old Dominion Foundation, another foundation of his. So it really started in 1943, and the first publication was Maud Oakes's book on the Navajo sand paintings with Joe Campbell's folkloristic commentary. It was a very and it was Zimmer who had urged them to make their first publication something American. Zimmer then died quite suddenly.
Do you think that was good advice?
Yes, I should think so. I think it would have been ill-advised to plunge right into publishing Jung. They couldn't have mounted the edition anyway at that stage of history. I think it was tactful to use the Indian thing, aside of its great value and interest. And there was an exhibition of the sand paintings in the National Gallery of Art. You know, it was a nice, splashy beginning for something. It had wonderful reviews, and it also launched Campbell, as it so happened. There were possibly a half a dozen books brought out in the Bollingen under the Old Dominion aegis. And then in 1945, the Bollingen Foundation was established all over again. with the publishing program as the nucleus.
So it's
And
really had several births.
it had at least two. And then Mary was to go over the following year to see Jung and begin to plan the edition. And she suddenly changed her mind for some inner reason, not made entirely clear. And John Barrett, who had been brought in as the assistant editor, went instead and met Jung and Furber and all the rest of them. After he came back and gave a report, there was another month, and then Mary died in October quite suddenly of a heart attack brought on by riding and an allergy to horse dust, asthma. That was the background.
And what effect then did the sudden death have on Bollingen? I mean, Bollingen has gone on in a very strong way.
Yes. Well, Barrett went immediately to the Mellons' estate in Virginia, Oak Spring, to be with Paul and to be there for the funeral. And the first thing Paul said to him when he came in the house was, we will go on with Mary's plans, that nothing will be changed. And in a short time, Barrett became the editor of the series and was the leader of the whole thing from there on, eventually the president of the foundation. There's one curious, interesting thing that when Mary had to abolish the Bollingen Foundation, the letters that her lawyers wrote on her behalf to Jung were very tactless and offended him. And there was a break where he didn't write to her for a while. He was quite put out by the abandoning of the project. And just after the war, when Herbert Reed, an editor of Routledge and Kegan Paul, was able to get to Switzerland just after the end of hostilities, he called on Jung and proposed a collected works without knowing anything about the Bollingen Mellon plan for a collected works. You see, Routledge had been Jung's publishers for many years, going back to 1916. And this was Reed's own idea to do a collected edition. And Jung agreed. And so when Mary cabled him to asking him whether she could go on with her plan, he answered, "Have signed with Routledge, sorry." And there was a great confusion and unhappiness. And the upshot of it all was that Herbert Reed came to New York and he met Mary Mellon and Jack Barrett, and they decided to make a common venture of it. Routledge had the contracts with Jung, and the Mellons had the money. That made a perfect match.
And what happened on the personal level? I recall, I don't know the date, a very warm letter of Jung to Mary during the war years.
Yes, there are lovely letters up until this break that I mentioned, yes. And then a cooling off, and then toward the end his letters to her were quite formal, Dear Mrs. Mellon, whereas they had been Dear Mary. But as soon as things got moving again, Jung seems to have taken a much better view of it all, and his last couple of letters to her are cordial enough. And then he liked Barrett, who carried on.
Do you have any idea what the lawyers said, or what was so offensive? Was it just lawyers protecting this wealthy woman from...
Yes, it was. There was the very definite suggestion in the letters that Jung might have been in touch with enemy propaganda as a Swiss. You see, after all, the German embassies and so on were open in Switzerland, along with the American. There was all sorts of spy hanky-panky going on, and the extremely cautious lawyers for the Mellon family, who probably thought that Mary's plans were rather screwy anyway, said, "This is alarming. This will compromise the Mellon name, and mustn't allow this to go on at all." There had also been a FBI or maybe it was CIA, no, FBI at that point, investigation of Olga Furber, who had come over just about then on a visit. And when she went back, flying back, the days of the Clipper, instead of taking her route through France, through Spain and France, she flew through Germany. And this, at that time, England was at war with Germany, and as she went through Bermuda, this was noticed, and she got on the blacklist. this compromised the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. So the war was just a ripe time for the shadow projections to fly, if there was anything uncertain about his work or
Yes.
the people.
Precisely.
Do you think she was naive to do that, to fly through Germany? Did she know what she was doing?
She was
all this?
completely unpolitical. She wouldn't have
Yeah.
had the sophistication. It was just a question of getting there in the quickest
yeah.
way. And she had her valuable briefcase full of alchemical pictures and so on that she'd collected. Those utterly baffled the intelligence officers in Bermuda. They imagined there was something sinister about them. This is all known. But Mary was naive, too. And her letters to Jung were very gushy.
Yes.
And girlish. And it was perfectly clear that Jung didn't take her very seriously at the beginning. He liked her. In fact, there's a very warm, almost erotic tone to some of his early letters to
Yes.
her. Discussions of dreams she was having and so on. But he was used to dealing with hard-boiled publishers of the Routledge and Keegan Paul sort.
Well, since the Mellons provided the money in this match, I wonder if they hadn't been around, if it hadn't happened fatefully that they had gotten involved, what would have the story been on publishing Jung's work?
Routledge would have gone ahead, although I don't know how they would have financed it. It probably would have...
Taken longer, huh?
It's inconceivable it could have taken any longer. You know, it took over 30 years to finish the edition after the first discussions of it. Nobody thought that would happen. They said 8 or 10 years, nothing to it. But Routledge would undoubtedly have found an American co-publisher, and there were several houses that had published Jung, principally Harcourt Race. And something of the sort would surely have happened, but perhaps not on the same scale as the Bollingen-sponsored one.
What is your own theory about why it took so long, the 30-year period instead of 10?
Well, any editor who finds that all his predictions for getting the book out quickly fall through is at a loss to explain why exactly it happened. It happens all the time. After all, our machinery was rather complicated. The editors were in England. The translator was in either Switzerland or Mallorca. The exchange of proofs and so on was very slow. We couldn't stick to strict schedules with our printers, so that when that happens, printers can't guarantee delivery time. So there was delay at every stage.
Did Jung himself have anything to do with the slowness of it? Was he finicky, or...?
There was nothing about Jung's approach that slowed it up, and Jung became extremely disturbed and unhappy in the early years at the slow rate, and wrote very angrily to Herbert Reed. He said, "I feel that none of my work will come out in my lifetime, and I'm terribly offended and sorry that I got mixed up in it to begin with." It was a very emotional letter. And that was the point at which we reorganized the editorial machinery so that we thought we could go more quickly. And possibly we went as quickly as we could. But everything was fairly complicated.
How did Jung relate to the translation? Did he carefully follow Hull's...
Yes, at the beginning he resented Hull's appointment because he hadn't been consulted. He didn't know who Hull was. He had picked out as the translator Barbara Hanna. Mary Mellon, on her part, had wanted Carrie Baines to be the translator. Carrie immediately declined. Couldn't have done it, she said. However, Barbara had gone on and translated Psychology and Alchemy, for example, and also the Psychology of the Transference. And those translations had been delivered to Routledge, even. So that when Herbert Reed picked Hull, a man he'd known for some while as a translator, who, however, had no Jungian background whatsoever, Jung resented this. And when Herbert wrote to Jung and said, "Well, Hull is an excellent translator. He's translated Rilke," and he mentioned one or two famous German sociologists, and Jung says, "Well, my work is nothing like Rilke's or those other people's. I don't know why you picked this man out." Foisted him on me. But as soon as one of Hull's translations was delivered to Jung, and he compared it with Barber's, he had to say, quite generously, that poor Barber's translation was limping, was the word he used in German, holperig, and Hull's was just great. From there on, everything. And Barbara remained as a consultant. There were no hard feelings. She was very valuable.
Hmm. Well, that's very interesting.
And he and Hull formed a great working relationship. They met frequently and discussed problems and corresponded a great deal directly. Hull should have gone through the editors routinely, regulation-wise, but he and Jung, we simply corresponded directly, and this helped a great deal.
Mm-hmm. So then you got kind of gradually pulled in, innocently. Did you have any relationship to Jung's work at all before you began your editing here in New York?
Practically none. I was in analysis with a Freudian psychoanalyst just before, at the beginning of my involvement with the Bollingen. And when I told him I had been asked to edit something to do with Jung, he said, well, we'll see how you like that. He's very mystical. In any case, it was all new country to me, but fascinating. I had already edited Joe Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces, and that was a fascinating introduction to all that world. But Joe was indebted as much to Freudian insights as Jungian in that book.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Did you tell Jung that you were in Freudian analysis? Were you?
Yes, and he said he thought that was fine. You know that he didn't like doctrinaire, a doctrinaire approach to his work. He has been known to say that he was glad he wasn't a Jungian. So I think it half amused him to think that somebody working on the edition had a different background. Mm-hmm. And I always felt that I brought something because of that background, something that was possibly a slight corrective. I got into many arguments and quarrels with the translator, who had become a very doctrinaire Jungian in short order.
You're speaking of Hull?
Hull, yes.
I see. A convert.
Yes, my goodness, yes, all of the qualities of a convert. But with Fordham and Adler, there was never any difficulty over that other involvement of mine.
Mm-hmm. How was it that the Bollingen Foundation and the press got located at Princeton, or what is the...
Well, as I say, the foundation was established in 45, and it went on for 20 very prosperous years of publishing. But in the mid-60s, Paul Mellon himself began to talk of bringing it to an end gradually. There were several different motives for that. I think in the background were the difficulties being raised by new tax laws and by attacks on foundations in general, and the Bollingen in particular, by Congressman Patman, who was, in many ways, he made a great contribution in trying to combat crooked or worthless or devious foundations. But he didn't have the understanding of what a foundation like the Bollingen, or for that matter the Ford, really did for the community. So his attacks on the Bollingen were quite narrow-minded. You know, the very idea of wasting money, he never mentioned Jung, but he said wasting money translating the works of somebody named Hugo von Hofmannsthal, or sponsoring a fellowship to study tombstones in Yugoslavia. Who wants it? Huh. Well, this was in the background, but Paul's feelings were also that John Barrett was reaching retirement age. He wanted to feel that the whole Bollingen contribution was something that his own group had done in their lifetime, not to be passed on. He said that. So the whole thing was arranged, needless to say, in a very businesslike way. First, the fellowship program was brought to an end around 65, and the gifts to archaeology and all sorts of humane projects were ended. But the publishing program couldn't be ended because there were contracts, commitments, had to be carried on. But it had to be given to a non-profit entity, which obviously had to be a university press. And Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, and one or two smaller presses were all in the running. And the choice fell on Princeton for various reasons, partly because the personality of its director appealed to people in the Bollingen world. He was a younger man than the others. Perhaps Yale had already enjoyed as much of Paul's patronage as he thought was necessary. So in 1967, the press took over the publishing of the series and the distribution from Pantheon. And there was a 2-year trial period, so-called. And I went out with the program, you see. And then in '69, everybody seemed to be pleased with the way it had gone, and it was given lock, stock, and barrel to Princeton to stock the contracts, and a sum of money to carry on the editing.
To some finished point, then?
To complete all the commitments that the Bollingen had made, which had added up to a neat 100 projects in the series, 100 numbers. Some of the numbers cover one little book, and some cover the complete collected this or that.
And do you foresee when the 100 will be complete?
Possibly 6 or 8 years. The big collected works of Samuel Taylor Coleridge project will take some years more, and then a wonderful edition of archaeological excavations on Samothrace is going to be probably the last thing finished.
How do you feel about Mellon's position that he wants to see a finish point in his lifetime or among his own personal
Well, Paul's
contacts?
interests are many, and they have, and his focal points have changed over his life. After Mary died, she was his link really with the Jungian sort of thing. He always, though, was fond of Jung as a person and respected him greatly, and went to see him in Europe, went to the Aranos once more after, and then he remarried 2 or 3 years after Mary died, Bunny Lloyd, and he took her to meet Jung and to meet the Aranos people. But inevitably, his interest went in another direction. French Impressionist painting, he liked it a great deal of that, and above all, horses, breeding horses and race horses.
Bill, you said something earlier about the naivete of Olga flying through Germany, and perhaps Mary herself, Mary Mellon, had a certain naive quality. I wonder if, in your impression over the years, there's something that's almost typical of people who've gotten deeply involved with Jung's work, in the sense of being either unworldly or perhaps naive politically. Does that fit your impression, or?
Gee, I don't know whether I dare to make a generalization along those lines. There are all kinds of people in the Jungian fold. Mary was extremely extroverted. Violet de Laszlo, did you interview her?
No.
Said that she was the most extroverted person she ever met. And what was her function type then? I can't be sure. It certainly wasn't a sensation, because she wasn't very systematic about anything.
Probably feeling.
Feeling, I suppose. She was an enthusiast who threw herself into far too many things and spread herself too thin, because besides her Bollingen interest during those years in the 40s, she was involved in many other things. She wanted to start a museum of Indian art in the Southwest. She wanted to start television programs for children that would be good instead of lousy. None of these things ever got anywhere, unhappily. She invested money in a nightclub in New York where people went and played canasta. And she was trying to educate her children her own self. She was studying alchemy. She started to write a biography of Margaret Fuller. She wanted to translate one of Denis de Rougemont's books. She formed a very close friendship with him. And you see how it was.
I see. Well, then, aside from her personality, I just am still interested in your own impressions, and I know this is a generalization and therefore dangerous, of the kind of people who went for Jung, so to speak, early. I mean, his work was avant-garde, was breakthrough kind of work, and you've seen that world as it's evolved, and you've also participated somewhat in the Freudian world, if there is a separate world, and you've been involved in university life. So from that vantage point, you kind of have a unique look at things. Is there anything typical about the kind of people that readily accepted Jung's breakthrough?
Well, there's a certain kind of idealism that one can generalize about. There is a respect for, I don't mean to say the mystical, but a respect for the spiritual, or an acceptance that there is a spiritual element, whereas the other type of person would begin by assuming there was no spiritual element to be concerned with. But then, along with that, there is a curious, oftentimes fuzziness, impracticality, and unrealism about how to spend one's time. Maybe that's the reason our audition went so slowly. And a tendency to talk at great length without getting a great deal done, which doesn't sound very introverted, but it certainly is a characteristic that I'm aware of.
Do you have any idea why Jung didn't come back to the States? His last trip was in '38, I believe.
That's right. He came to, I think that was the year he came and lectured at Yale, and had some, what he must have found very enjoyable and stimulating contact at Yale with the Professor Irwin Goodenough, who later did the great work on the Jewish symbols. I think it was health entirely, because his health was tricky after the war. He'd had the rush with death, and I don't believe he would, I don't know whether he ever flew in a plane, for that matter, but that was surely the reason, just that.
And you were having, by then, yearly visits in the 50s to Jung.
Yes, and his American friends all made their way to Zurich and saw him, constant stream of him.
He retained an affection for American people. I noticed.
Yes, very much unlike Freud, who conceived a dislike for things American. Jung's contact with America was as early as, I think, 1905 or 6 or 7, when American psychiatrists came to the Berkeley to work with him on the association experiments. And his own visit was, to him, a lot of fun, stimulating indeed.
In your visits to Jung, did you meet Mrs. Jung?
Yes, she didn't sit with us when we were talking about the work, as a rule. She'd often greet me and then go off and do something else. But when we sat to lunch, she would be there, and she would always ask about one's family, those nice questions that someone like that would ask. Then there was the one time I was sort of stranded there, and she discovered I wasn't getting my lunch, and immediately had lunch prepared for me, and we sat together for that. The other time was at Bollingen, when this was in the last year of her life, and she died later that year. I remember being struck at how much weight she'd lost. She looked ill. But we talked, all of us, and then I took pictures of them. And that picture of Jung and her together at Bollingen has been reproduced a few times. One sees that she's in poor health at that point. I suppose she'd already become ill with cancer.
Mm-hmm. She was, during those years that you met her, a practicing analyst, I believe.
Indeed. I suppose she was still seeing patients in those last years of all, but I'm not really certain.
Did you meet with Tony Wolfe at all during those years?
I never did. We overlapped, I should have said, a few years there, and I wanted to meet her. She was living outside of Zurich then in Baden, I think. But it never quite worked out, and then she died rather suddenly. The other Bollingen people knew her, and of course Gerhard Adler was very close to her. Her famous book, which was published after her death, the Bollingen contributed some money toward that publication at Jung's specific request. It was interesting to see Jung writing to the foundation and asking for financial support for something. And Jung himself wanted to see the book published. And I think Meyer then took over and was responsible for the practical aspects of it. And later, the Jung Foundation in New York arranged to have it translated with the intention of publishing it in their program. It was translated.
But it hasn't been published, has it?
It has not been published. There have been several expressions of interest in publishing it by one or another publisher. The problem is that none of the publishers that are interested in it want to reimburse the several $1,000s of expenses the New York Foundation had in having it translated and edited. Something will come of it eventually.
Do you know if Jung ever wrote about his relationship to Tony Wolfe in any serious way?
Well, I do know that in the original protocols that Agnelli Jaffe set down in the course of her interviews with Jung, in preparing what became Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung did speak of her by name and told of some dreams about her, went over the visit to Ravenna when she was with him, and at that stage had every intention of making her part of the story. But that was material that was finally left out. Whether that was Jung's considered wish later on, or whether it was his family who wanted Tony left out, because they want her left out always, as a personal part of Jung's life, I don't know the answer.
The impression I get is that he was rather more open than his family about everything.
Yes.
Considering his own life, his own personal life.
I would say so. Yes. He didn't want Tony, so people have told me that knew them well, to be considered somebody in the back streets of his life. She was of importance almost equal to Emma's. Possibly more so at some times. But people much closer to the whole thing tell me that in the later years he drew closer to Emma than to Tony.
In Emma's book on the Grail, did he ever ask for support for that? Was he involved in that at all, or did he leave it alone?
You know that I'm not sure. I have a faint suspicion he did ask for help with that, but I can't be sure. It's something I could dig out of some archives. It's interesting. Of course, it was unfinished, and then he must have had something to do with Mary Louise von Franz's taking it on.
Did she speak ever of that work in your presence? I know she was steeped in it for years.
No. Talked about children.
I see.
Exchanged recipes.
What was the year that you first met Jung?
It was 1954. I had made my first trip to Switzerland in 1953 and met Hull again, who was then in Ascona. And I must have met some of the people in Zurich, but why I didn't meet Jung then, I don't know. The following year, I went quite early, and someone said, if you're going to call on Jung, it's the first day of spring. What would that be, March 21st? and you should take a bouquet of something in particular. I can't think what. Well, I followed that, and I did take him the prescribed bouquet, and that seemed to please him a lot. I remember that I got off the train in Küsnacht, had the address on Seestrasse, but had no idea where it was. It's a terribly long walk, so I was quite late in getting there. Didn't seem to matter. It was my first encounter with a box hedge, strangely enough, and you go through a long box hedge walking up through Jung's estate to the house. And I didn't know that box smells like urine. That was the odor. And I couldn't think what in the world was the reason why Jung's garden had such a curious smell. Later on I understood it.
How did you understand it?
Someone said, well, that's the way box always smells. Didn't you know that? Yeah.
Nothing so symbolic as...
We usually, we didn't talk in his study. I wish we'd had. I would have enjoyed more sitting there. We usually sat out on a terrace, and it was more informal than that. Sometimes we'd walk in the garden, and he showed me some of the stone carvings that he'd done. Later on, when I was there after Tony Wolfe's death, he showed me something he'd done in memory of her that was in the garden. Whether it's still there, I don't know. It was either a stone or a wood carving. But on one of my early visits, Jung had suddenly become interested in contemporary painting, which he had up till then distrusted. You know, his paper on Picasso is really quite Philistine almost. And he once was sitting at an Eranos conference when Herbert Reed began to lecture on some aspect of modern art, and Jung got up and stumped out.
Yes.
Went upstairs and kept kicking on the floor, so it seemed to spoil the effect of Reed's lecture. But when he was doing the flying saucers studies, what led up to that, he suddenly got interested in fantastic paintings, if not non-objective. And he had a few there. And he talked mostly about them that particular time, pointed things out with the stem of his pipe. And when we sat down to lunch, at this point I'm not sure whether it was after Emma's death and Ruth Bailey was there or not, probably so. He mixed the salad dressing. This was something he seems to have taken pride in doing. He had a great large wooden spoon in which he poured the oil and vinegar and the seasonings, mixed them up, and then threw that in the salad bowl, proceeded to mix it first rate. And he talked about wine a great deal and told me which wines I should ask for. Mayenfelder was supposed to be especially good. It comes from a little bit further up from Zurich. These were not very, these weren't technical conversations we had as a rule. We talked about the simplest things. And he would, in a sort of perfunctory way, ask about the work, and I'd show him a little schedule of where things stood and what we planned to do. And he would seem to be pleased. And by this time, several volumes had come out. It was perfectly evident that the edition was going to make it, you know. But he was simple and very nice.
Did he ever touch on anything that was painful to him about his reputation? For example, the allegations of his anti-Semitism. Did that ever come up?
That never came up, but he did speak up once about the attacks on him at the time of the Ezra Pound Prize. You know that the Bollingen Prize in Poetry was awarded to the Library of Congress Fellows Board to Ezra Pound the first year. And that caused a tremendous controversy. And accusations were made that there was a conspiracy between Ezra Pound, whose politics were really quite reprehensible, and the rich man Paul Mellon and the pro-Nazi anti-Semite Jung. There were such things written up, and it was the Bollingen Foundation reeled under the effect of all this, but didn't give up. Jung referred to that more than once. He seemed to feel he was inclined, I think, in a rather a way that I didn't quite agree with, to blame it on Freudians. I'm sure it was much more complicated than that.
On a personal level, did you ever pick up anything of his shadow? I mean, things that bothered you, or was it just, I mean, you really visited him only once a year, so maybe you didn't know him that well.
I can recall nothing he ever said that I could have taken exception to at all.
Mm.
I can recall things I've read in letters he's written that I wish he'd said in another way, but not personally, no. Once after his death, I went there. By that time, I think his son and daughter were living there. Son and daughter-in-law were living there, Franz and Lily Jung, and I was allowed to work in the study upstairs, which was pretty much unchanged. I was checking some bibliography. And lying on the table was a photograph, an old photograph that I picked up and looked at with curiosity. It was a man and woman. But after a moment, I realized that it was Carl and Emma Jung, each dressed in the other's clothes. My impulse was to put it in my pocket, but I didn't. I put it back down and brooded about this. Well, I later talked to Agnella Jaffe about it. She said, well, they were dressed up for the carnival. They were in costume for the carnival, Jung. But it was a fantastic, a picture that has never, as far as I know, come to light again.
Oh, I wish you had
Wouldn't
pocketed it.
I wish I had, too. Agnella denied any knowledge of it. She was his secretary then, of course. I don't think that's a shadow side. I think it's a very brightly lighted side.
Yes. It brings me to another subject about that room. I remember from the film Vanderpost did with the BBC, pictures of the Red Book on the desk there.
Yes.
And has that ever come up? It seems a shame to see that go to dust.
Yes, I never saw the Red Book or knew much about it in my time. Hull went once on his last visit to Jung before Hull himself moved to Spain, and Agnella Jaffe was showing Hull pictures in the Red Book when Jung appeared to greet Hull and said angrily, "Put that away," which surprised her because at that point it wasn't supposed to be under wraps at all. Before the pictures from it appeared in the Vanderpost film, or in C.G. Jung Word and Image, well before that, I was aware of the Red Book, and I wrote on behalf of the Bollingen to the Jung family, urging that we prepare a publication of it so that it would be done under the very respectable auspices of the Bollingen, with all of its resources. And they were very much against it, and said they felt it should just be put away and never reproduced at all. Then, of course, Vanderpost apparently persuaded them to use it.
And Jung himself took no position, apparently, on its publication or on its being hidden, or...
I don't believe so. He mentions it in Memories, Dreams, Reflections.
Uh-huh.
And he did permit... I think some of his mandala paintings are in the Red Book. Indeed they are. He reproduced them first himself. Mm-hmm. Didn't say they were his.
But I have gathered the impression that he left Bollingen itself, the retreat, with its paintings and with his own personal objects and everything, to the family, and took no attitude toward it as if it belonged to his life and his objective history. I mean, the family now uses it as a retreat and so on. He could have taken another tack, couldn't he? He could have seen this as an extension of his work, and...
He could have left it to the Institute.
Uh-huh.
But Jung was, I think, primarily a Swiss with those strong family ties. And he would, in the last analysis, he'd do the conventional thing, I think.
I see.
Well, he may have been pressed in any case. It was left to the family, and I understand, I've never been back since those days, but I understand it's used as a weekend place by different members of the family. Mm-hmm. But I suppose they've preserved everything. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. I understand that Lewis Mumford wrote a review of Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Did Mumford know Jung a bit?
No, he came to Zurich after Jung's death. He had written an important review of Memories, Dreams, Deflections. It was in the New Yorker, long review, very sensitive. And then he went back to lecture, and that was the time he saw Emma and Tony Wolfe's pictures hung up in the Institute, side by side. Do you know this article? And he then wrote an article for the New Yorker, a sort of a travel account of his European visit, mentioned this, and it was published, and he described Tony as Jung's mistress. It was the first time that had ever been stated in print. The two pictures disappeared from the walls of the Institute. Or at least Tony's did. The family continues to be extremely conservative about any revelations about Jung's private life. I had thought a few years ago that the generation to which his son and daughters belong would give over the responsibilities to the next generation, who would be more objective. But that hasn't happened as yet. And the sisters and the brother are, I think, united in wanting to present a very Swiss bourgeois image of Jung.